Hello guys, Folk Collector here, bringing you this beautiful $5 1899 large size silver certificate, also known as the Chief Note. Now, if you are a US currency collector, you probably already have this banknote in your collection. I am kind of late to the game. I usually collect worldwide banknotes. So recently I got my hands on the Bison note and I made that video. Do check it out. I'll leave the link in the description below. Now the Chief Note. These two notes are probably the most desirable of all the old US currency, especially the large size. This one is so iconic because of the fact that this is the only paper currency. Now we're not talking about coins. This is the only paper currency issued by US government featuring an image of a Native American Indian chief. We've had some obsolete paper currency issued by local and private banks featuring vignettes of Native Americans, but this is the only paper currency issued by the government featuring a prominent Indian chief. Here we have this bold portrait of Sioux chief running Antelope. Now let's hear from the chief. Hello there, I am Chief Running Antelope, also known as Hunk Papa. I am a Lakota tribe chief of the Great Sioux Nation. I was born in South Dakota in 1821. I signed peace treaty with US government, which led to creation of the Great Sioux Reservation in 1868, and I received a peace medal for my efforts and bravery in keeping peace. In 1850s, our way of life was threatened by European settlers moving west and taking our land by force. Unlike Sitting Bull and other tribal chiefs, I chose the path of peace. Thank you, Chief, for that introduction. Just for clarification, the Sioux Indian tribe is made up of two major divisions. We have the Dakota Indians, that's Dakota with a D, and also Lakota Indians, Lakota with an L. And the chief belonged to the Lakota Sioux Indian tribe. And Sioux Indian tribe, both of these divisions combined, were mainly in the central Mississippi Valley, which is current day Wisconsin, Minnesota, North and South Dakota. So the chief received his peace medal in 1868 for signing Treaty of Fort Laramie. And 4 years later, in 1872, he was invited to Washington, D.C. by President Ulysses Grant. And during his visit, the chief sat in for two photographs by photographer Alexander Gardner. Now let's take a look at those photographs.
These are the two actual photographs of Chief Running Antelope taken by Alexander Gardner during his visit to Washington, D.C., to meet with President Ulysses Grant. The chief is seated, wearing three large feathers in his hair as headgear, with braider hair, wearing peace medal and holding a feather fan.
So these photographs were eventually used by engraver George Smiley to create this final portrait of the chief. But he made a big modification. Instead of using the original three long feather headgear of Lakota chief, he instead put on a different headgear from a rival tribe called Pawnee. Now, different tribes have different headgears or war bonnet, and they're made up of feathers. Each individual feather is earned as an act of bravery or courage. When you have enough feathers, then you can put together your headgear. Now, when he was creating this portrait, it was deemed that the original three long feather headgear was a bit too large for this allotted space. So instead, he took it upon himself to then swap, the three long feathers for this full feathered headgear and it just so happened to be a headgear of a rival Indian tribe. And this portrait, this banknote came out in 1899. It was literally 2 years after the passing of Chief Running Antelope. He died in 1897. So 2 years later, when this banknote came out, the chief was no longer around to object to this modification. But needless to say, the Sioux tribal leaders of that time were not impressed. They were not pleased.
If George Smiley, the engraver, had used the original, unmodified headgear of the chief running antelope, with 3 large feathers, this is probably how the portrait would have looked like on the banknote.
So a big question in my mind, at least, is why in 1899 they chose to put a Native American Indian chief as a central figure on the banknote. Now, it had never been done before, and it certainly was not done again afterwards. So why in 1899? And the second question is, if you're going to pick a Native American Indian chief, why did they pick Chief Running Antelope? Now, I don't have concrete answers to these questions, but my best guess is, at least for the first question, is the fact that 9 years earlier, we had this terrible massacre called the Massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890, where the U.S. Army troops killed around 300 Lakota Indians in South Dakota. And this tragedy, the wounds from this tragedy were still quite fresh, and it was a big stain on U.S. government and Indian relations. So I feel that by issuing this banknote celebrating Chief Running Antelope, who had died 2 years earlier in 1897, this was sort of a extension of olive branch, if you will, to the Native American community. It obviously did not make up for this massacre or this tragic, bloody history, but it was a start. Now, the answer to the second question, also, I don't have any concrete answers, but my guess is it made sense to put on this banknote a peaceful Indian tribal chief like Running Antelope, who, signed the peace treaty, was willing to cooperate with the U.S. government. He finally assimilated into the reservation culture. So he was considered quote-unquote good Indian. So it served the U.S. government interest to put quote-unquote good Indian as opposed to a bad Indian. Now, example of what would be considered a bad Indian according to U.S. government standards would be, the counterpart of Chief Antelope was Chief Sitting Bull. He refused to sign the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and he was a renegade chief. He was very well respected for his bravery, but he made U.S. Army look bad. So that's why Sitting Bull is not on this portrait. Instead, we have Chief Running Antelope. Now, a side note on what happened to Chief Sitting Bull. He was actually younger than Chief Running Antelope. He, like I said, rejected the peace treaty in 1868, and then he later escaped to Canada, the Saskatchewan territory, and eventually in 1881 he surrendered. But unfortunately, he was brutally shot and killed in 1890 by reservation police. And then 2 weeks after that, in 1890, we had the infamous massacre of Wounded Knee. So things did not end well for Sitting Bull. And as far as Chief Running Antelope, he chose the path of peace, and hence he is celebrated here, this portrait on the $5 silver certificate. Okay, let's talk briefly about the Indian reservation system. So in 1830, Andrew Jackson signed this Indian Removal Act, which allowed US government to force Indian tribes to surrender their land by signing peace treaty. And in 1851, Indian Appropriation Act created the Indian reservation system, whereby the tribes would give up majority of their land and the natural resources and relocate to a smaller parcel of land, which would be recognized by federal law as sovereign tribal territory, what's called the native nation. Now, this would allow them to self-govern in these reservations, maintain their social and cultural traditions. They were also provided food rations, access to education, farming, and other federally funded benefits. So it was basically an attempt to assimilate these nomads into white American culture. Currently, around 300 or so reservations exist for over 500 federally recognized tribes. These people living on reservations are US citizens, but they are not taxed. They also get housing assistance. They have to follow the federal and tribal law, but the state law does not apply to them. Navajo Nation is probably one of the most desirable of these reservations, but majority of the reservations suffer from poverty, lack of access to good education, and usually the overall violence rate is higher than the national average. The sad part in all of this is the fact that Chief Running Antelope, who was throughout his life very cooperative with the US government, would come to regret this later in his life, seeing how Indians were mistreated and how US government would repeatedly go back on its word whenever it suited their needs. An example of this is the fact that initially in 1868, the Sioux Nation was allocated 60 million acres to their reservation, which in matter of only 20 years would dwindle down to only 12 million acres. So from 60 million acres to 12 million acres by 1887, which is like 20% of its original size. So this is one example of how Indian tribes were misled, and some of these prominent chiefs who did choose to cooperate would then later learn that they got the short end of the stick. So this is the sad history that we have with Native American tribes living on an Indian reservation with their land taken away by US government. Let's quickly look at the design of the banknote. We have silver certificate written on the top and repeated twice on the bottom. United States of America. You have the serial numbers, the seal, and denomination 5 and Roman numeral 5 in blue, which is a really good contrast. This particular banknote comes in 11 different signature combinations. We're talking about the signature of the Registrar of Treasury and the Secretary of the United States. Mine is Teehee and Burke, which gives it a free Burke number 271. We have all the way from 271 to 281. And the signature combination that's really desirable is Napier and Thompson. It's the most expensive of all the other combinations, although the best kept secret is, Houston Teehee. Houston Teehee is the only signature of all the combinations available that I find most interesting. And I'm so glad I have the Teehee Burke combination, because Teehee was a Cherokee Indian lawyer. So the fact that you have a Indian note with the Indian chief and another Indian, a prominent Indian, who was the Registrar of Treasury, his signature on that same note makes it so special. Let's take a look at the back of the note. The back of the note is quite plain. Unlike other banknotes with some allegorical figure on the back, they chose to not do that for this particular banknote. I wish they had used some sort of Indian art or other Indian artifact on the back, and that would have made it even more special. I'm not complaining. Overall, this banknote is gorgeous. I'm lucky to have this particular note in this superb condition without any major folds, tears. It's a PMG 35, although I would say it looks more like a 40 or a 45. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do like, share, and subscribe, and keep collecting.